Good morning, everyone. My music does not want to work this morning. I don't know if you can hear what I have on in the background, but welcome to the Healing Hour. My name is Sarah Fargo O'Brien. I am your host. Today we're going to be talking about complex PTSD. But before I get to my slide deck, let me get myself organized here. If you're here, let me know that you're here. Let me check in with you guys. I am back on a regular flow, except of course, I already have had a change to next week. The show is going to be at 12 p.m. Eastern instead of 11 a.m. Eastern. I have a meeting in the morning that is just set at that time that I can't change. So I have to change the time of this because this is the most flexible. So here we are, another Thursday, October 5th. No. Jeez, where am I? I don't know what October 5th is. Thursday, August 7th. Yeah, scratch that. Today is Thursday, August the 7th, 2025. I am Sarah O'Brien outside of Richmond, Virginia, and your trusty host for the Healing Hour podcast, where we talk about trauma-informed care, trauma-informed leadership, mental health, and all the things that are impactful in relationships, both inside and outside of workplaces. And that is where I spend my time, both as a psychotherapist and as a leadership strategist. It is basically doing treatment, healing, and then education, speaking, and training about that treatment, healing, and what works, and then how to adopt some of these principles in non-clinical settings. So if you need a speaker for your podcast or a webinar or workshop host on any of these topics, feel free to reach out to me. You can find all information about me and how to get in contact with me on my website, and that is www.sarahobrien.lcsw.com. That is Sarah, S-A-R-A-H, O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N, LCSW.com. Y'all, it's a day. It's been a week. I am beyond frustrated. The IRS is back telling me something from this year is incorrect and I owe them $2,500 when I do not, in fact, owe them that. But now I have to prove to them that I don't owe them that, which is a lot of work. This is ridiculous. I did this the first half of this year. I spent many months dealing with the IRS and getting that sorted just to have a new issue come up. I made a large purchase at a local retailer 2 months ago. Our item was supposed to be delivered within 60 days. That would be tomorrow. We have found out this week that the company went out of business. They're refusing to do refunds, and we have no idea what's happening. And so now I'm going to have to figure that out and fight that whole situation, which is super frustrating. On top of insurance is now taking 60 days or more to pay. So I am 2 months in the rear in getting paid for my psychotherapy services. And I am working on a white paper with Integrate Trauma Informed Networks ethicist Laura Miller, and Next Gen Ethics is Laura Miller's company, and Julie Johnson and some of my other folks at Integrate. We were working on a white paper about AI and mental health care. And let me tell y'all, doing the research for this and reading about what's happening and what people are saying, all of these things have my blood boiling today. It's probably triggering a lot of my complex PTSD, which is a diagnosis I carry, a disorder that I have and try to deal with on a daily basis. And when I feel taken advantage of, when I feel like institutions have administrative burden that just make things really difficult, when companies and businesses engage in really shitty business practices, and lying and deceiving to make a sale. All of these things trigger my trauma. We're going to talk about some of that today. And that is where I'm at. I am super frustrated, honestly, straight up pissed this morning. So even though I had time to walk my dog, get ready, and do all my normal things, I am like up in myself. So as per usual, I'll take 3 deep breaths. We will dive into content. If you're here, let me know. If you catch the replay, awesome. Drop a comment when you catch the replay. Let me know what you think of this podcast. All right, so in through your nose, out through your mouth. Take 3 deep breaths with me. Number 1. Slow exhale. Breath number 2. Last one, slow inhale, slow exhale. Okay. I'm a little bit more in touch with myself now. Good morning, Leanna. I'm so happy that you are here again. My tried and true audience member. I so appreciate that you are here so that I know that I'm at least talking to Leanna and not into the void. If you are here, let me know. I will interact with you guys as much as I can. I don't have quite as much content as I did in July. The neuroscience of anxiety and the neuroscience of addiction and the neuroscience of trouble was a lot of material to kind of get through and to pare down to make reasonable sense to everybody that's not a neuroscientist, me included. So that was a lot of work and a lot of content. We have a little bit less today, so I should be able to interact maybe a little bit more, answer your questions. Of course, I have my coffee, my badass coffee. And we will dive in. Let me see if I can get my slide deck back up here. Okay. So, complex PTSD. What is it? Is it different than regular PTSD, if that's what we're going to call it? And if so, how? We're going to dive into all of this today. So, excuse me, coffee there. All right. Complex PTSD, or CPTSD, is a form of the disorder that has several additional characteristics beyond those of standard PTSD. I guess we can call it standard instead of regular. CPTSD typically develops after prolonged trauma and is more common if someone experiences trauma repeatedly over an extended period of time. So we are specifically going to be talking about definition of CPTSD and how it's different than standard PTSD, trauma situations and trauma characteristics that are causes of CPTSD, the impact, the neurophysiological impact, behavioral impact, and relational impact. Last month, when I was talking about the neuroscience of those disorders, we talked a lot about the neurophysiological impact and the behavioral impact. So hopefully that will make sense to some of my regular folks that watch. And then we're going to be talking about what do we do about complex PTSD? How do we treat it? How do we care for ourselves? Self-compassion, self-care, and trauma-informed care, of course, which is where I stand. The juxtaposition between clinical treatment and macro social work is trauma-informed care. And so I sit sort of at that juncture. Again, if you would like me to speak, I also write. I don't say this usually live, but I have co-authored 3 international best-selling books. I have been published over 50 times. And I write regularly. And so if you need a newsletter, if you need a brief, if you need a blog article, explaining what some of this stuff is for your office, for your hospital, for your team, for your organization, I can do that, as well as speak, hold a workshop, and all of that for you out there, non-clinical settings, to understand more about mental health, about trauma, how it impacts people's behavior and performance, and then what we can do about that, particularly in workplaces. So here we go. Complex PTSD. What is it? Complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD, is a mental health condition that you can develop if you experience chronic trauma or long-term trauma. Complex PTSD is typically caused by repeated intense or prolonged traumatic situations. So this is experiencing a situation over and over and over again, or being in the same situation for a long time. So that's how we can talk about repeated and prolonged trauma. This involves stress responses or nervous system reactions, even after the trauma situation has passed. These are involuntary and difficult to manage, these stress responses. Symptoms of standard PTSD and CPTSD are worse for people who experience discrimination or marginalization due to race, gender, sexuality, disability, class, ethnicity, and other factors. There's my friend. Hi, Jason. So happy to see you. Glad you are here, my friend. He also says hello to Leanna. I'm so glad that you are here, Jason, and you're interacting with my bunch. I know Jason has been enjoying my podcast recently and letting me know. Jason is my partner, sort of in a way, or I'm his partner, director of student wellness for his nonprofit, which is HR4U, and then the subset of that, Transformation Kitchen, which is helping individuals overlooked by the system get living wage jobs in the culinary services, which is Jason's background. And he has started this nonprofit from the ground up, and it is growing, and it is awesome. Check out Jason's page. There's a big event coming up in October. You can get tickets for that. It's going to be pretty cool. And it's a fundraiser for this awesome nonprofit. So there's my plug for my buddy Jason. I'm so glad that he's here, and I'm so happy to be working with him. And I know that he gets this stuff, and he gets this about me. He understands that I am a professional that also has mental health disorders, and that's fine. We have alignment in that, right? And so this is often where I talk about like showing up authentically and then finding alignment, especially in work, in that way. And Jason is a great example of somebody who shows up authentically himself, and then allows me to show up authentically myself. And we really sort of gel that way. And likewise, my buddy Jason says, we appreciate you in the work you help us do. And it is my joy and passion to do so. Working with the students with Transformation Kitchen has been such an interesting and fun experience. I am loving watching the growth of the program and of the students, and we are excited to do more. Okay, so that's my mid-complex PTSD definition plug for somebody else who gets it and doing the work out there in the world, the real work that helps meet people where they are, whether they've had addiction or trauma or mental health disorders or an awful childhood or former incarceration or former homelessness or any of those things, that we can meet people where they are without judgment, with care and compassion. And in doing that, it helps people succeed and heal. It's pretty remarkable to see. And I don't know who wouldn't want to be a part of this kind of movement. So trauma-informed care is where it's at if you want to be part of it. Okay, so let's talk about complex PTSD and similarities to standard PTSD. Both result from trauma, of course. Each of these conditions causes fear and anxiety, and that's often activated, formerly known as triggered, by the memory of previous traumatic events. People diagnosed with either of these disorders may experience flashback, nightmares, or insomnia. Re-experiencing is this idea of flashbacks or nightmares or recurring memories, okay? The most recognizable symptom of re-experiencing is flashbacks. And these are unwanted, intrusive thoughts, visuals, or events in which a person relives their trauma. So a flashback is not just like a memory and a visual representation. It is like a whole body experience. That's why it's called re-experiencing. So a flashback actually puts us back in the nervous system space that we were in when the trauma was actually happening, right? So your body and your brain don't know the difference, even though you are experiencing a flashback. It feels like current, present time that this is happening. Flashbacks are often activated by reminders of the trauma and tend to cause intense distress and confusion, as you can imagine. Re-experiencing can also take the form of recurring dreams or memories. So it doesn't just have to be nightmares and flashbacks. You could just have recurring and repetitive thoughts and memories about your past trauma. Again, these are intrusive. We don't want to do this. This is just kind of what happens. Some other similarities to standard PTSD are experiencing hyperarousal or hypervigilance. Both disorders can cause people to feel on guard all of the time. It may cause someone to feel constantly under threat, and or they may startle easily. Startle easily is me. My spouse can just like walk into the kitchen or the pantry and I didn't hear him, and it makes me shout, like scream, like I'm totally startled. And I've been that way for a long time. That's probably related to my trauma, but like that's how it can happen, right? Like this is something that a real person experiences as a result of complex PTSD or PTSD. Hyperarousal can also result in insomnia, irritability, anxiety, increased blood pressure, or a rapid heart rate. So it's not just the hypervigilance of scanning for danger, it's actually hyperarousal in your nervous system, in your physiological system. Hyperarousal means that we are sort of in the stress state and in stress response a lot. And with that comes the output of cortisol and some other neurobiological things that I talked about last week when I talked about the neuroscience of trauma. And so part of the neuroscience of trauma is understanding increased blood pressure, rapid heart rate, changes in breathing. And that is what they can see in scans and some other things in individuals with these symptoms. So hyperarousal and hypervigilance sort of can be interchangeable, but they speak to both sort of like the cognitive scanning and the neurophysiological responses of hyperarousal. Hyperarousal can also cause difficulty concentrating, poor focus, and difficulty with task completion. It's kind of like feeling like all the time, or that's going on inside of you. And it can be really hard to focus when that is the experience that you are having inside of you. Another symptom that both disorders can experience is avoidance. People with PTSD or CPTSD will absolutely go out of their way to avoid reminders of their trauma. These reminders may be people, places, objects, or even specific thoughts and feelings. So avoidance of thoughts and feelings would be finding ways to shut it down, using substances, shopping, other distracting kinds of things to avoid those thoughts and feelings, as well as specific people, places, and things. If we talk about things, individuals that are post military combat often have a reaction, a nervous system reaction to the smell of diesel fuel. This is something my grandfather used to say, and that would basically activate or re-trigger his trauma from active combat zones. And my grandfather fought in the D-Day invasion of World War II and in Korea. So we know that those were absolutely intense battles. And it makes sense that when he smells diesel fuel, that it sort of puts him back in the re-experiencing of the trauma of his wartime active duty experience. And then he may also avoid smelling diesel fuel, and so that could look like never wanting to go pump your gas, things like that, and that can actually happen for some people in an effort to avoid re-experiencing or having reminders of their past trauma. So if you look at this middle slide here, number 2, or this middle box, so re-experiencing hyperarousal and avoidance are similar symptoms with standard PTSD. Both CPTSD and standard PTSD can experience re-experiencing or flashbacks, hyperarousal, and or avoidance. In addition to those, there are some other symptoms with PTSD or CPTSD, excuse me, that sort of come along with that diagnosis. And while standard PTSD can develop from a single standalone traumatic event, as well as from prolonged trauma. So let's be clear, it doesn't just have to be a single standalone event. And that's the distinction between PTSD and CPTSD. It's not the distinction. Prolonged trauma can also cause PTSD. I would say that being in an active wartime zone absolutely is prolonged trauma, and it doesn't always result in complex PTSD. It might just result in PTSD. Something like a car accident would be something that somebody could develop PTSD from. And then a lot of their fear would maybe circle around driving a car, being in a car, that kind of thing. Let's see. Jason, I'll answer your question in just a minute. So single standalone event, as well as prolonged trauma, can cause PTSD. Complex PTSD, however, generally develops when trauma happens repeatedly over a sustained period. People with CPTSD have sort of extreme or enhanced or more intense symptoms of PTSD. So that includes the re-experiencing hyperarousal avoidance, as well as experiencing a negative self-view. Those with CPTSD may feel ashamed, guilty, or helpless after experiencing long-lasting trauma. And these feelings can continue well after the trauma has stopped. They can also, so in addition to, let me go back one slide. In addition to re-experiencing hyperarousal and avoidance, CPTSD also comes with a negative self-view, difficulty controlling emotions, and difficulty in relationships. So before I dive into what those are, let me see if I can answer Chasen's question. Chasen says, is it more that people experiencing PTSD learn coping mechanisms, or is there healing in some form? Both or either. It depends. There are definitely coping strategies and mechanisms we can use to manage things, to manage activations and things that happen in our body. And then also healing can happen. And if you watched my Neuroscience of Trauma podcast last week, healing is really brain changes that sort of go back to their typical way of functioning. So it's rewiring the brain back from its adaptations that are not helpful. So healing can happen if people with PTSD engage in healing work, therapy, and treatment for that. Specifically therapy treatment to change brain processes and functions. And part of that is learning coping strategies for activations. Part of learning coping strategies for activations is teaching your body that it doesn't need to be activated. And so we calm it down. I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, give me a little bit more context and I will try to speak to that. Okay, so we're talking about complex PTSD. Symptoms of re-experiencing hyperarousal, avoidance, a negative self-view, and now we're on difficulty controlling emotions. CPTSD can cause people to have trouble regulating their feelings and emotions. These folks may struggle with explosive anger, depression, anxiety, and or suicidal thoughts. These folks also experience relationship difficulties. Their past trauma experiences often make it harder for people with CPTSD to trust others, which can strain relationships. They may also find themselves in unhealthy relationships that resemble past traumatic ones. This isn't on purpose. This is sort of out of view. People end up like repeating behaviors and patterns of behaviors that have them end up in the same situations sort of unknowingly. That's definitely happened to me. And that's how somebody can end up in relationships that resemble past trauma or trauma from past relationships. And complex PTSD usually occurs in the context of relationships, not necessarily, but if you're sustaining long-term trauma, it's usually not from a stranger. It's somebody that we interact with regularly. Folks with CPTSD may experience nervous system activations, formerly known as triggers, in the presence of new people. And it's possible that they don't know why their nervous system is reacting, especially if they lack conscious awareness of their trauma. So, this could be lacking conscious awareness that they've actually had a trauma experience, but their body is holding that experience there, and their body is activated when they try to form new relationships, sort of saying, hey, danger, danger, danger. And so, that is something that you could see in folks with CPTSD. Let's talk about some causes. So these are specific traumatic situations that can cause CPTSD. Experiencing domestic abuse, being a prisoner of war, living in a war-torn area, being abducted, enslaved, or tortured, being coerced into sex work or human trafficking, long-term child physical abuse, sexual abuse, and or emotional abuse and neglect, living with a person who is in active substance misuse or addiction, being a victim of a cult or other coercive control group, experiencing or witnessing frequent community violence, experiencing prolonged domestic violence, including emotional and psychological abuse, such as gaslighting. So this doesn't need to be prolonged physical or sexual abuse as an adult. This could be prolonged emotional and psychological abuse, like gaslighting, and other things that come with somebody with narcissistic traits. Experiencing torture, genocide, and slavery. These all seem like very extreme situations, and they are, in fact, which is why complex PTSD is sort of an extreme version of PTSD, meaning we experience in things more intensely, maybe more frequently, and for a longer duration, which makes sense because these traumatic situations are more intense, or maybe repeated in nature, and usually over a longer duration of time. Somebody isn't usually a prisoner of war for one day. It's an ongoing experience. It's not like a standalone event. If you are coerced into human trafficking, that again is a prolonged situation, if you're even able to get out of it. These are very intense situations. People over here in the US might be like, yeah, we don't experience this. And you should probably, I don't know, thank your lucky stars, God, or the US military servicemen and women who make it so that we don't experience these things, or very often. But lots of people do. Lots of people do in other countries. Lots of people do in this country. Back last summer, and I'm sure it's still happening, there is a sort of a large cult group that has been infiltrating to coerce people basically into sex work and human trafficking via wellness coaching. So selling wellness coaching packages, relief from sexual trauma, no less. And what it really is a coercive control group or a cult that is grooming you and bringing you in, and then eventually manipulating you and using psychedelic drugs in which to do so. And that happened right in St. Louis, Missouri. It happens in the US. It happened last summer. I know specific people it has happened to. Yes, professionals that I've worked with have gotten caught up in a coercive group because they were manipulated and controlled, and in fact are potentially still stuck in that coercive group. So although we would say this doesn't happen here, it does happen here. Does it happen less in other places? Honestly, I don't know. But we need to pay attention to these things, and not just say that's not for me. I don't live in a war-torn area. But things could happen at any time in which anybody is experiencing long-term or extensive traumatic situations or circumstances. And you can imagine that if somebody has lived through any of the things on this list, that they got to use the words here, they might be pretty fucked up after that, right? Like, it makes sense that things will not be working well for them mentally, physically, psychologically, in their nervous system, in their relationship abilities, right? Like, that is going to be impaired because to survive a situation as intense as these, takes a whole lot, right, from a person, a whole lot inside of you, that your body and your brain is doing to try to keep you alive through that situation. And those adaptations are extreme and may be helpful for the traumatic circumstance that you find yourself in. But if we live past these circumstances, those things are no longer helpful to us in a non-traumatic circumstance, yet those things still are there. They still live inside us. They're still in our brain. They're still in our body. And so healing and treatment is what sort of moves us out of our body and our brain responding as if everything is the same as this traumatic circumstance. Okay. Sort of like teaching your brain and your body that you're not in it anymore, that you survived it. All the things that you had to do to survive it were not normal, but typical for surviving an abnormal situation. And now that we are out of the abnormal situation, it's very non-typical to respond and behave in these ways. And we sort of have to retrain ourselves, our brain, our bodies, and our nervous systems. And I agree with you, Chasen. That is horrible. It's amazing that these things happen. It's absolutely batshit bananas that somebody could be coerced into sex work and human trafficking and coercive control in the United States of America, yet it does happen. And so, again, I'm all about awareness, education, advocacy, understanding. This is talking about the things that people don't want to talk about, can't put our heads in the sand about it. I would love to. I can't. My job does not allow me to put my head in the sand about any of these things. So instead, I try to learn about them, understand how we can work with them, and of course, doing my part in the healing world. All right, let's talk about some characteristics of folks that may be more vulnerable to experiencing extreme traumatic situations that cause complex PTSD. Some experts believe that, like I said, some people are more likely to develop CPTSD than others. If they first experience trauma at a young age, they are more likely to develop CPTSD. If the perpetrator of the trauma that someone experienced was someone in a position of trust, such as a parent, coach, teacher, pastor, primary caretaker, they are more likely to develop PTSD. If the trauma took place, like we have said several times, over a long period of time, like with childhood trauma or domestic violence situations, those folks are more likely to develop CPTSD. If escape from the trauma circumstance or situation was difficult or impossible, like when you're a child and you're experiencing abuse at the hands of your caretakers, it's impossible to get out of that situation because you also need them to meet your needs, which is very confusing for a child in terms of development and function. Also, domestic violence situations feel very difficult to escape. Coercive control cults feel impossible or difficult to escape. Some of those things, if you find yourself in a traumatic situation where escape was difficult or impossible, it could be that you develop CPTSD. If someone has had multiple traumas, it's more likely they will develop CPTSD. If they lack any trauma treatment and have trauma histories, then it's likely that CPTSD will develop. If a person lacks awareness or acceptance of the trauma they've experienced, this could result in CPTSD. If we go into self-invalidation or dismissal of our trauma experiences, this can lead to CPTSD. And there's a higher likelihood for people who experience discrimination, kind of what, or marginalization, what I mentioned in the beginning with the first slide. There's a higher likelihood that the people who experience discrimination and marginalization are higher likelihood they will develop CPTSD. Another friend in the house. Hi, Tracy. Good to see you. I'm so glad that you are here. Okay. let's talk about the neurophysiological impact of complex PTSD. Basically, these are brain and physiology changes, which expose themselves externally as behaviors and symptoms. I talked about this when I talked about the neuroscience of trauma last week in my podcast. Neuroadaptations are brain changes, right? And some of these brain changes, like we talked about with trauma last week, can be lasting, unless we are very active in reversing those, like I said, and training the brain in a different way. So the brain and physiology changes that show themselves externally as behaviors and symptoms of CPTSD often leave folks behaving in ways, in the ways that they do, that are difficult, unhelpful, or don't make any sense to others. So because of these brain changes, they will engage in action and behaviors that don't make sense to you. It's like, what is this person doing? This is a crazy person. No, this is likely a person that has developed CPTSD, and that's why their behaviors are difficult, unhelpful, and don't make sense to you. Maybe a person who has not experienced CPTSD or intense traumatic situations. So I always like to say that to keep it in mind. This is not a choice, folks. People do not choose to have complex PTSD. People do not choose to live through extreme and significant and difficult trauma situations. They do not choose to have their brain and physiology change as a result of that. That's just what happens. And then if you make it to the other side of that, you have to then deal with that, which is a lot of fucking work, folks. I've been doing it for a long time. Myself, my own trauma healing work, I have been doing for a long time, and it is a lot of work to try to get through that. Okay, so yes, it makes sense that these folks are going to engage in things that are not helpful because they're out of a trauma situation. And we just said the things that your brain and body does to survive a trauma situation are not helpful post-trauma situation, yet they are still there. Okay, that is the change to your brain's chemistry and structure. And studies have suggested that trauma is associated with permanent changes in your brain's chemistry and structure. Go back and watch my podcast on the neuroscience of trauma to understand a little bit more in detail what that is. As a refresher, there can be permanent and lasting changes in the area in the amygdala, and this is the part of your brain that processes fear and other emotions, and it's your fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. The hippocampus is the part of the brain that's largely responsible for learning and memory. And the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that's involved in executive functions such as planning, decision-making, personality, expression, and controlling social behavior. And that's where we see issues. Prefrontal cortex damage, such as planning, decision-making, personality, expression, and controlling social behavior. This is impaired at a neurological level, folks. That's why people with trauma behave in ways that are difficult or don't make sense to you. Again, they are not choosing to be difficult or not to make sense. It often will be difficult and not make sense to them. They are sort of stuck in this body that is not functioning the way that it should because this body has been injured internally. Okay, that's what trauma is. So let's go into a little bit more detail about the behavioral impact. So because of neurophysiological changes, that comes out as symptoms and behaviors. Common symptoms are things that we see, feel, or experience as a result of prolonged trauma. We talked about this: flashbacks, the re-experiencing of the traumatic event, avoidance, and detachment. So avoidance would be avoiding, right, people, places, and things. Detachment is sort of like being present there, but not connected to people, events, environmental triggers of the trauma. So that is sort of like a numbing, a depersonalization, which is different than avoidance. Other impacts behaviorally, things that we see, feel, or experience. Someone gives excessive attention to the possibility of danger. This is the hypervigilance. A person may have frequent negative thoughts and emotions. These are intrusive thoughts that take over typical cognitive functioning, causing distraction and distress, as well as problems, like I said earlier, in decision making and personality expression and social behavior. Behavioral impacts of having CPTSD, things we see, feel, and experience also include a negative sense of self involving persistent feelings of shame, guilt, failure, and worthlessness. They also can experience excessive reactivity to negative emotional stimuli, and specifically react with anger and aggressive behavior, known as affective dysregulation or affect dysregulation. This is me. You guys have heard me say this. I know Chasen has heard me say this in wellness coaching sessions, as well as in our own personal conversations. Anger and aggressive behavior is my go-to reactivity. When my trauma is activated or I experience a trigger, anger and aggressiveness comes out so fast. Hairline trigger, right? Split second. It takes no time for me to go to 0 to 100. And totally losing my shit. You guys would not recognize me. I don't recognize me. It feels really bad in my body, and then it feels really bad socially, relationally on the other side, because I didn't really mean to do that, but that is how my system learned how to survive my traumatic environment. That is one of those unhelpful and difficult behaviors that doesn't make sense to anybody. Why is she flipping out about this? It's because my trauma got triggered. And honestly, like, until a few minutes afterwards, I probably don't even realize that I'm screaming. It takes a lot of work to deal with that reactivity in terms of coping. It takes even more work to change your brain at a neurophysiological level to reduce that reactivity. So what I can do behaviorally is manage and cope with the reactivity. What we do in psychotherapy treatment is change the brain back to reduce the reactivity to begin with. I hope that makes sense. Some more behavioral impact of severe traumatic situations that result in CPTSD. These folks have severe difficulty in forming and maintaining meaningful relationships. This is often due to poor models, faulty core beliefs, mistrust, and reactivity. Like I said, if you're in reactivity, that's a difficult behavior for other people to be around. If you don't trust people, then it's difficult for you to be around people and develop relationships. If you have faulty core beliefs that tell you that you're not good enough, that you're unlovable, that you're worthless, these are my faulty core beliefs and scripts, then that makes it difficult to like show up in a healthy way in trying to engage in relationships. I'm also a person that had poor models. Not only did my abuse happen in my family system, lots of emotional and psychological abuse and neglect, but there were poor models amongst my family, my parents, about what a healthy relationship looks like. So of course, I end up with trouble developing healthy relationships, as does everybody else surviving severe traumatic situations and those that develop CPTSD as a result of surviving those extreme and severe traumatic situations. Okay, let's talk about what others see this behavioral impact, like what comes out. Others see anxious behavior, a focus on safety, and feeling fearful about things others don't feel fearful about. Other people might see someone have a worldview that's negative and pessimistic, like an outlook that's just like everything's bad, everything sucks, nothing gets better, the world is shit kind of space. Other people might see distraction or disconnection in conversations or in interpersonal interactions and events. Others may see a person with CPTSD have a persistent focus on themselves and their feelings. That is because they are overwhelmed by that. They are confused by that. They don't know what to do with that. It doesn't make sense to them. And they've likely told themselves it's not okay to have their feelings, because that's often what results in a trauma situation. So there's often persistent focus on that because they kind of don't know what to do with that. And nobody has focused on their feelings in a positive way. They've been invalidated and dismissed via the trauma. Other people may see somebody who has a self-view that's negative and depressing. They're self-deprecating. They don't think they're good at anything. They don't think anything is going to get better. They believe that they're worthless. Others may see intense reactivity to small things. Like I was saying before, an anger outburst or aggressive behavior when activated. These are things other people can see that are typical symptoms, actions, activations, and responses for somebody who has CPTSD. Still talking about the impact behavioral. So let's talk about what the person who is diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, what they experience behaviorally. Reminder about the symptoms. I just want to go over that again because it's kind of what we're talking about. Manifestations of these like symptoms. Re-experiencing, which are flashbacks or recurring thoughts or memories. Avoidance or detachment from trauma triggers or people, places, and situations that may trigger. Hypervigilance to danger and hyperarousal in the body. Frequent intrusive thoughts, negative self-view, and emotional reactivity. These are the things that people experience with complex PTSD. So how does that feel for the person experiencing it? What is the behavioral impact for this person? So what they experience is a lack of calm or feelings of peace. They have a worldview where they are often let down or not cared for or not seen. They are often fielding frequent unwanted thoughts about their trauma and themselves. They have a lack of certainty about who to trust and can't get close to others as a result. They experience low self-esteem and believe there is something wrong with them. They often have intense and confusing feelings. They often feel out of control of themselves, experience extensive shame about their activations and reactions. That's me with my anger, aggressive outbursts. Then I feel intense shame because I didn't mean to do that, but it's hard for me to control that when a trigger happens, and often left believing they are unlovable. So if we go back, what you guys see is anxious behavior, a focus on safety, feeling fearful about things that other people don't feel fearful about. And then what is happening for that person is a lack of calm or feelings of peace ever. Okay, others see a worldview that's negative and pessimistic and everything is shitty and nothing will turn out well. And they experience a worldview where they are often let down or not cared for or not seen. So it is negative because their experience of life is that it has been negative. Other people see distraction or disconnection in conversation. And what the person is experiencing is they are distracted and disconnected because they're having unwanted thoughts about their thoughts and their trauma. Others may see a persistent focus on themselves and their feelings. And this can sort of translate into a person experiencing lack of certainty about who to trust, can't get close to others, talking a lot about themselves, unsure of how to actually function in relationships. Oops. And what the person is experiencing, a persistent focus on themselves and their feelings. And what the person with CPTSD is experiencing when we see that is low self-esteem and believing there's something wrong with them. That's why there's a focus on themselves all the time. They're trying to figure out why they feel this way, why they react this way, what's wrong with them. So it looks very self-involved and selfish. And I guess in a way that it is, but it's not like it's boasting or they feel good about themselves. They are stuck trying to figure themselves out, basically. What others see, a self-view that's negative and depressing. And what happens inside of them is shame about their actions and activations and believing that they're unlovable. Intense reactivity and the anger outbursts that others see. show up for the person with CPTSD is intense and often confusing feelings and feeling out of control of themselves, which is why they have intense reactivity to small things and anger outbursts or aggressive behavior when activated, and they feel out of control of themselves. So I hope this is helpful in like what we see is difficult and unhelpful behavior that doesn't make sense and is hard to live with. And what they are experiencing are feelings and behaviors that are difficult, unhelpful, and hard for them to live with. And so I point this out because just because you're experiencing somebody with trauma sort of in a negative way, they're experiencing that in a negative way too. This isn't fun for anybody. And the more compassion that we can extend to somebody experiencing this, the more likely they can tap into some of their own self-compassion. They're having a hard time with that. They don't know how to do that. Nobody's ever done that for them. So if you see like difficult behavior, instead of judging them, instead of saying they should act right or be an adult or get their shit together, maybe you can say, gosh, something must have happened for them to like be behaving this way. Maybe they just need somebody to understand or listen or not judge them or give them a hug or an encouraging word, right? This is where we get to trauma-informed care and action and why it's helpful. Okay, we're going to talk about the impact of CPTSD on relationships. So the relational impact, we talked about the neurophysiological impact, which are permanent and lasting changes in the brain unless we work to reversing that. We talked about behavioral impact, so what others see and like what comes out in the behavior manifestations of the CPTSD symptoms, and then what the person maybe experiences internally as a result of having those symptoms. And now I'm going to give you a little bit more personal information, which I often do, because it's not a breach of confidentiality for me to talk about my own mental health, even though I could back up probably just about everything I say about myself, that my clients that have CPTSD also experience to some degree. So this isn't just me. This is actually coming from me working with thousands of people at this point in my career, and many of them having CPTSD, and this being true sort of across the board as well as in the research. So I'm giving it to you guys, the impact relationally as a personal reflection of my, sort of review of the impact on relationships as a result of my CPTSD. But understand that this stuff is also still rooted in science. It's still rooted in neuroscience, and it has been replicated over and over and over again in my clinical work with people. So this isn't just my experience, but I am talking about it from my experience. So a person with CPTSD always feels on guard, especially around people that they have attached to or have attachment to. This hypervigilance about people and people's reactions, responses, facial expressions, behaviors makes it really difficult for the person with CPTSD to feel relaxed and calm around others. And this is true for me. I often feel on edge or anxious. I'm also often trying to read sort of everything that's going on. It's very exhausting. It takes a lot of energy. I usually feel really bad about myself. It's very complicated and very difficult for me. Okay, and another way that it impacts relationally is every interpersonal experience is stressful for me, every single one, whether it's 5 minutes or 5 hours, or if I've known you for 100 years or 100 days. Okay. So for me, this isn't a reflection on you. It's a reflection on me. For me, it's probably maybe not even a reflection on our relationship, but it's a reflection on me and what's happened inside of me and what shows up for me when I engage in interpersonal interactions. It triggers a lot of my trauma. Okay. So every interaction I have with people is stressful for me. Intense reactivity to negative things that occur in relationships. Or more accurately stated, I have intense reactivity to potentially negative things that could occur in relationships. And what I mean by that is like whatever it is, potentially negative things, what are those things? A conflict, a look, a comment, a change in tone doesn't actually have to produce a negative outcome or a negative outcome relationally. Or a negative outcome for me, for an intense reaction to that behavior itself, which could just be a look or a change in tone or something like that. So I start to get intense reactivity and negative feelings to the potential that there will be a breakdown in relationship as a result of a look, a comment, or a tone, even if that doesn't actually lead to a negative outcome in the relationship. I am activated and reacting to the comment, the look, the tone, not the outcome. And in fact, in that space, you can't tell my brain, hey, the outcome's fine. It's going to be fine. Or, hey, the outcome with your best friend of 25 years has always been fine. It's going to be fine. That does not matter to my nervous system that is reacting to the trauma. My prefrontal cortex is offline and does not care about that reasoning and logical reasoning and explanation for what's going on here. My body and my nervous system and my brain are like, ooh, when somebody switches tone like that, it means bad. That doesn't mean I even have to see it all the way through to it being bad. It's just the thing that happens in the moment can trigger an intense reaction from me. That is how it impacts relationally. Sometimes then it's hard for me to stay in the conversation because I'm activated and they didn't mean to do that and it hasn't led to a negative outcome. But if I'm activated and then I'm shouting, then it's likely to lead to a negative outcome where I feel abandoned and not seen, which then just sort of triggers everything all over again. But I didn't mean to react that way. My system was just like, ooh, this seems bad. This seems danger, and off to the races, right? Then shame hits me. And then without, good models or practice in healthy relationships, I don't know how to repair after that either. Like it's just a mess in relationships often for folks with CPTSD. Okay, impact relationally. We're rounding the corner, guys. I know we're coming up on the hour. This leads to responding to negative emotional stimuli. Examples, someone giving me a strange look when I say something, or someone ignoring me or invalidating me when I share a feeling or need, with anger, aggressiveness, and defensiveness. I've explained this to you guys before. And this is like the protecting part of me. When this protector comes out, the anger, it means I'm afraid or hurt or feel alone or misunderstood or not seen, which would mean I feel hurt by that. And so it's very counterintuitive and contraindicative of like what you are seeing from me in behavior. When I'm aggressively lashing out, somebody's first thought is not, oh, that woman is hurt and feels afraid. Nobody's thinking that. They're thinking she's batshit crazy and losing her mind, right? And it's really something else under there. And it probably took my therapist 6 years to understand this about me. As much as I tried to explain, like, it was hard to have words for it before I started doing a deep dive into my own trauma healing, researching more of this stuff, talking about it, educating others, and getting more specialized in my practice for this. And so that's what I mean. When you see anger and aggressiveness and defensiveness, I need you to pause before you judge them for 1 second and just say, maybe something happened to them that causes them to react that way. Okay, this is where we extend compassion. And I'm a person who needs it as much as anybody else. So yeah, that's not how it translates to others, obviously. And others find this behavior difficult to deal with and often don't have patience or empathy for it. Somebody who's angry and aggressive and defensive, yes, will rub you the wrong way. We often don't have empathy for it, me included. I have to check myself on this when other people do it, even though I do it, okay? So 2 symptoms I want to touch on and the impact they have relationally. The persistent focus on self and feelings and this anger, aggressiveness. These things also often come across to people as narcissism, that you're absorbed with yourself, that you don't care about other people, that you don't care about how you treat other people, that it's all about you. You can only see things through like your lens. And it's like, I want to make a clear distinction. These are not narcissistic people. These are traumatized people, and their brain doesn't know what to do. They focus a lot on themselves and their feelings because they've never been addressed. Their needs have never been met, and they don't know how to do it for themselves. Okay, so until they get some trauma treatment and start practicing some of these things, it's going to look a lot like narcissism. And I need everybody just to pause when they feel like that's the case, and try to just consider, could it be trauma instead? Because it very well could be. Okay. That's me and some of my personal reflection about how CPTSD shows up and impacts relationships. It has absolutely impacted my relationships in the last 3 years as I've been neck deep now in my trauma healing. I rarely spend time with other people because it is so much energy and so much of my stress response just happens. So until I get some more healing under my belt and some more skills, I have to be very strategic about when and who I spend time with and paying attention to what kind of space I'm in. For me to be able to show up well relationally, it is very, very difficult for me, which is why I don't do it often. And it takes a lot of energy. So I'm very much an extroverted person. I love being around people. I was a very busy, very social person prior to 3 years ago, pretty much my whole life. Now I don't leave my house like 5-6 days a week because it's just better for my nervous system and I don't need to. I do see people every week. I see the same ladies at my Zumba class every Thursday. My Zumba instructor happens to be a child neurologist. So that's just kind of cool. We talk shop sometimes. So although I don't see them often or outside the context of my exercise class, I do see them every week at my exercise class. I have some friends that I talk with regularly, see less regularly, but could. I make it a point to travel out of town to meet with my trauma-informed friends because that's much better for my nervous system. It just doesn't happen too frequently. So it's not that I'm completely isolated, although I do still feel lonely a lot of the time because I used to be really busy with people a lot of the time. But in stepping back and recognizing how much energy and how much wear and tear that was putting on my nervous system, and I had to make a change while I'm trying to be in this healing space. So that leads us into this last little bit here of how do we heal? Well, self-compassion is where it has to start. And that's really hard when you've been really negative towards yourself and other people have too because of your difficult behaviors. Okay. We have to understand that CPTSD is a lifelong condition. It's often something that we're just going to manage throughout life. We can achieve healing from it. We can achieve reduced symptoms from it. But for many, this is going to be lifelong and they're going to have to manage it lifelong. Healing from trauma starts with self-compassion and adequate, sustainable self-care practices. A person also needs to access treatment with a trauma-informed clinician. That piece is important because trauma-informed is how you do the treatment, not what treatment you use. And we need trauma-informed understanding to not cause further harm in the provision of treatment for trauma. Okay, which is why I suggest a trauma-informed clinician. So it doesn't matter if they do EMDR. I need them to be a trauma-informed clinician that does EMDR. Okay, that kind of thing. So how one can heal in therapy from a self perspective, this is what you can do, have self-compassion. The way we have self-compassion is we start with having adequate and sustainable self-care practices. We look to find a trauma-informed treatment provider to work on the healing part. In therapy, we have to address our faulty core beliefs and the scripts you live by that are no longer helpful. In therapy and yoga and coaching, you can gain self-awareness and body awareness, learning your body cues for wants and needs, and distress, right? Find supportive people. Feeling supported and accepted as is before healing even begins, while you are stuck still in those difficult behaviors, is what we all need to heal. We need others to bear witness to our stories and our pain to complete the stress cycle and find rest and recovery. And we can't heal in complete isolation. Okay, so those are things you can do for yourself. And now out there in the treatment world, you can look for these things, and or trauma treatment providers listen up. And providing compassionate care means providing trauma-informed care. So using trauma-focused CBT, I use this frequently, involves, this is the last slide was things you can do for yourself. Self-care practices, find a trauma treatment provider, engage in some body awareness practices, and find the supportive network. Okay. Now, what you can do if you're getting external help or treatment is schedule regular appointments with a trauma-informed licensed clinician. You're not going to get from trauma if you go once a month, once in a while. If you're irregular with appointments, you need to schedule regularly. You need to be going regularly. You need to be doing the work in between sessions regularly. That is what's compassionate. If you drop in and out, then that's really not compassionate to yourself, because it's just activating things without closing it back up and finding a way forward. So regular appointments is what gives us that momentum and able to make those changes in your brain. Trauma-focused CBD also helps one learn how their body responds to trauma, stress, and discomfort, and learning how to notice and manage symptoms. It also involves identifying and reframing problematic thinking patterns, cognitive dissonance, and cognitive distortions. And there's nothing wrong with you guys. This is just what happens, especially if you experience early childhood trauma or one of those intense, prolonged situations. Exposure therapy. So an example of this would be not avoiding relationships because they are scary, but learning how to regulate during exposure to new relationships, right? This is something I was telling you guys, like, I don't spend a lot of time with people because it takes a lot of work for me to regulate to do that. And because that takes so much work, honestly, it's like really exhausting for me. And I can't focus on that all the time. Sometimes I need to restore. Sometimes I need to just feel peace and calm without having to work at it. And for me, that means like kind of being on my own where things feel safe. You can also tap into trauma healing with cognitive processing therapy. It can be a trauma-focused therapy. It's a treatment that addresses the distressing and often problematic thoughts and emotions that have developed since traumatic events, like faulty core beliefs and the scripts we live by. It might be my last one on that. Okay, yes, I couldn't remember if I had another one. So we have some. Oh, no, I do have one more. Okay. Cognitive processing therapy. Okay, I thought I had one more here. Okay, other trauma treatment modalities, but again, the how you do it is trauma informed. What you do could be trauma focused CBD, could be cognitive processing therapy, or it could be EMDR, psychodrama, tapping. These are all effective clinical interventions for treating trauma and trauma reactions and responses. Okay. My strongest suggestion is that your clinical treatment provider must be trauma informed and trauma responsive, despite the treatment modality they use, whether it's EMDR or trauma focused CBD or whatever. Any yoga instructor, mind body professional, or life coach also needs to be trauma informed. So whoever you are utilizing in your support system, in your care system, they need to be trauma informed. Otherwise, it runs the risk of causing more harm instead of helping. Okay, even if they mean to help, they can cause harm if they are not trauma informed and understand these things. This is why I talk about the need for trauma-informed care is everywhere, not just in clinical spaces, but absolutely necessary in clinical spaces. And I'm talking at your primary care doctor, at the cardiologist, at the dentist, all of those places too. This should be there, let alone in banks, in corporations, in workplaces, okay? The need for compassionate care is everywhere, and the need for trust and safety is everywhere. And trauma-informed care and trauma-informed leadership practices ensure that this is the case everywhere for everybody. There's basically no downside to this, even if you haven't experienced trauma. It will feel good as somebody engages in trauma-informed care with you, because it's really seeing somebody. It's building a foundation of trust together. It is understanding needs for safety, and that we have individual things that work for us in accessing safety. Okay. There we go with all the content. I hope it was interesting for you guys. Again, drop questions to my DMs or on this thread if you want to know more, have a question about something specific. How can I help you further with understanding complex PTSD? Well, you can go to the free resources section on my website, www.sarahobrienlcsw.com, and find the Trauma Responses Quick Reference Guide. This is a freebie I gave out in one of my newsletters a while ago. So if you're signed up for my newsletter via LinkedIn and not via my website, this is your opportunity to grab one of those freebies that I gave out a while ago. And the Love Yourself Workbook is another freebie that you can go download. Some of my digital products that you can purchase that will be extremely helpful if you have complex PTSD or standard PTSD is Dealing with Negative Thinking. That's a digital workbook that costs $19. You can go download it, pay for it, and download it right now. You heard me talking about self-compassion and compassionate self-care, and that needs to be a practice with sustainable habits. So I have created a workbook for you called Sustainable Self-Love and Self-Care, and is specifically for building sustainable habits for taking care of yourself in a compassionate way. This is another digital download. It's $29. It's very comprehensive. It's over 50 pages of content and activities and worksheets and journal things for you to do to develop some of these habits and patterns. You can schedule one-to-one skills coaching for learning body awareness cues, coping strategies, and of course, your business, corporation, hospital system, classroom, university, team, whatever. If you want to understand more about this and psychological safety in the workplace and how to employ trauma-informed care in the workplace, I am available for speaking, webinars, workshops, and consulting on that. I have a couple of other things just because I have so much on trauma and specifically PTSD, guys. Okay, so other things besides this podcast episode and the one last week on the neuroscience of trauma, you can go to my website and go to the Trauma Informed Leadership tab and watch the Healing from PTSD speaking event I did last August. You can go to that same page and look for the podcast episode where I was on the amazing Katie Kurtz, a Trauma Informed Future podcast, talking about the difference between trauma treatment modalities and trauma-informed care. You can go watch same tab, Trauma Informed Leadership tab. You can watch a webinar workshop I did for and with Integrate Network and Julie Johnson on empathy and action, which is trauma-informed skills, and resilience redefined, which is trauma-informed decision-making applied to self. And those will help more with understanding trauma, understanding what happens in trauma, and understanding how we deal with it. You can also read my blog article that goes into more detail even than this podcast about CPTSD. It's called The Invisible Disorder Complex PTSD. And my article for how to build trust. These are on my Medium page. So please go follow my Medium page. It's on my website under Media and Press to catch all my blog articles. I also have free journal templates and a free self-care checklist under those free resources tabs. Lots of things for you guys. Go to my website and check all that out. Continue learning, continue seeking knowledge on trauma, complex trauma especially, and reach out to me if you need help with this. Here, I got a little bit organized for you guys. I think this is what I'm going to do for the month of August. Topics. We talked about complex PTSD today. We're going to talk about betrayal trauma next week, except at a new time, 12 p.m. instead of 11. On the 21st of August, I'm going to talk about OCD. And on the 28th of August, I'm going to talk about excoriation, which is a picking disorder. So that's what we have coming up. For those of you that don't know, I'm a licensed psychotherapist, specifically a licensed clinical social worker in Virginia and Maryland, located outside Richmond, Virginia. Do have a couple of openings for some psychotherapy clients virtually, of course. Reach out to me if you live in Virginia or Maryland and need a therapist. I'm also a trauma-informed leader and leadership strategist, and I work with the national affinity group Integrate Trauma Informed Network. I write blog articles for them. I host workshops and webinars. I create content for our mental health support app. So a lot of stuff we're doing there. I'm also a trauma-informed coach and consultant. As I told you guys, the director of student wellness for Transformation Kitchen and working with Chasen's nonprofit, as well as therapist folks. I'm a private practice consultant or a clinical consultant. I've been a practicing therapist for over 16 years. So have a lot of experience. If you have questions about that, you can contact me and just schedule a consultation hour. I also need my own outlets, right? And the ways that calm and soothe my nervous system. Creativity, design, colors, fun stuff is the way that I do that. I do a bullet journal. I make bracelets, and those are things I do tangibly here at home, but I also do things digitally, and I've created some designs and opened an online Redbubble merch shop. And so you can get my designs on things like hats, t-shirts, sweatshirts, notebooks, coasters, whatever, stickers. So scan that QR code that's on your screen and go check out my fun merch shop. And here we are. Thank you for being here. Thank you for tuning in to the Healing Hour with me, your host, Sarah Fargo O'Brien. Your trauma-informed specialist for all things trauma healing, relationship building, and safety enhancing information. Always remember that you matter. And if you are a person that resonates with anything I've said, particularly in the last several podcasts about anxiety, addiction, trauma, and complex PTSD, understand there's nothing wrong with you. Something happened to you. There are options. There are options for coping. There are options for healing. And there are options for people who care about your experience and the pain that you've been through and how that has manifested into lots of things that are difficult and unhelpful now. So find your people, get your support, find a way to get to your healing, and remember to always take care of yourself and take care of yourself first and always. Nobody else is going to do that. And you certainly can't take care of other people if you don't take care of yourself. I appreciate my friends being here. Tracy, Chasen, Leanna, I appreciate you popping in, giving me your questions and telling me that you're here and interacting with each other. Tell your friends. And I will see you guys next week. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is it for another episode of the Healing Hour. Bye, guys.